definitely the wormier of the two worms, as you shall see shortly. In the early 1990s, I experienced what I would now call an epistemological crisis. I was a medical student at the University of Michigan Medical School in Ann Arbor, and my undergraduate degree was in science, as was just said, primarily in science, and I had been raised as a Pentecostal. I was attending medical school with the purpose of becoming a medical missionary. That was the goal. But I found myself in a crisis because I believed that I was being compelled to choose between two incompatible options. In the mornings in medical school, while wearing a white coat, I was taking mock patient histories from elderly persons who had volunteered their time to help medical students train for this. And these volunteers treated our interviews very real. They took it seriously. And this is a very personal kind of activity. Taking a patient history is very personal because they tell you, just as you're your doctor, they tell you about their bodies, about their relatives who have died, and so it becomes a very personal conversation no matter how professional you try to be. In the afternoons, by contrast, it was a gross anatomy class, and so we were cutting up, dissecting cadavers of persons about the same age as the people I was interviewing in the mornings. And this was a long process. I'm sorry, this is kind of graphic, but over the course of a whole semester, we found, we exposed, we identified, removed every organ, every tissue, every ligament, and so on to get to what was underneath and behind it, identified it. Until at the end of the semester, hardly anything was left. And the effect in combination of these two aspects of my day, explaining all the behavior and parts of the body and so forth, as working together through biochemistry and physiology on the one hand, and through that human personal dimension in the morning, I couldn't reconcile those two. In the afternoon, the human being was being presented to me as something impersonal. And in the morning, the human person was being presented to me as something personal. So at the time, the only two options before me seemed to be between just those two accounts. Which one would I choose? I felt like I had to choose between them. I could either abandon the depersonalizing account of the afternoon and just cling to the personhood, the idea that persons are humans with feelings and beliefs and ambitions and desires, or I could jettison all that and just stick with science. Finally, after weeks of wrestling with this dilemma and after a long discussion with my wife, I chose to cling to the personal, not because I was anti-science, but because I could not deny the personal dimension of reality. I informed the dean of the medical school and my parents that I was leaving, and with no plan, no money, and no employment, I began a long journey of trying to find a way forward. After some years, I went on to study theology in seminary, at a Presbyterian seminary, and while in seminary, I began to study philosophy. And after completing my seminary, I went on to graduate work in philosophy, as was just said, and only after some years in philosophy did I finally figure out what was going on back in medical school. While I was in medical school, I couldn't have articulated this dilemma that I just laid out to you. I couldn't have done that. It was much more difficult than that. It was fuzzy, unclear. But while in graduate school as a philosopher, studying philosophy, I came to see that what I had been wrestling with was a particular philosophy, a particular ideology that I couldn't have identified at the time, namely scientism. Now, if you ever watch these videos, Word on Fire videos by Bishop Barron, you're going to know this term already, right? I'm not even going to ask to raise their hands, but I'm sure you've heard him talk about this. He talks about this all the time, rightly so, because it's a serious problem. But I didn't know what it was at the time. I couldn't identify it. It was a philosophical conflict, and I did not have the philosophical resources available to me to successfully deal with it or address it. So what is scientism? Just briefly. Scientism is not the same thing as science. Science, simply speaking, is this method by which we use hypothesis and experimentation. We do some kind of experiment to verify or falsify our hypothesis, right? It's this very well-known methodology. Scientism is completely different. Scientism is a philosophy, a philosophical claim. By contrast, it's a notion that knowledge comes only through science. That's what scientism is. And scientism is very common today. It's so common that it's part of the air we breathe, philosophically. So much so that it becomes invisible to us, invisible as scientism. That is, we're breathing the air of scientism all the time and not even realizing that we're doing so. Right? The fish does not know that it's wet. Why? Because it's been in water its whole life. If you're breathing scientism all the time, you don't even identify it. It's just there. It's just the way things are. That's what our young people are growing up under, scientism. That's the air they breathe. How do I know? Because they come into my classroom. At which time they learn about scientism. So, why did I tell this story? Because this is one example, my own case is one example of the way false philosophy can hinder and true philosophy can aid the integration of faith in life. I say that again because I see in some of my students, and I've been teaching for 18 years now, I see in some of my students, many of whom are Catholic, a kind of compartmentalization of faith. You know what I mean by that? Compartmentalize. Religion and faith, that's a Sunday thing, and the rest of my life, that's Monday through Saturday. And I don't integrate them together. So philosophy can help us integrate faith and life. I'm sure most of you are at least somewhat familiar with the recent Pew study from 2015. I'll just say one line from that study. Nearly 1/3 of American adults say they were raised Catholic. Among that group, fully 41% no longer identify with Catholicism. Now, most of those 41% who are raised Catholics who leave or no longer identify as Catholics, they make that move when they're young, late teens, early 20s, primarily in college. So, this is when I see them, when they're in this process. Each semester, I've observed that while numerous factors influence students with regard to hanging on to their faith, remaining in their faith, growing in their faith, or rejecting their faith, philosophy plays a crucial role here. And most of the time, they don't even know it. It plays a role in providing resources for them either to defend their faith or to compartmentalize it or to evaluate criticisms of it. It plays a role in whether they're favorable toward their faith or whether they're suspicious and even embarrassed or ashamed of their faith. Philosophy plays a role here. Because if you know how to defend the faith philosophically, you're not ashamed. Why are you ashamed of the truth? But if you don't know how to defend it, then you feel sort of embarrassed. I don't know how to defend this criticism. So what I want to talk with you today about is the crucial and often overlooked way that philosophy, true philosophy, good philosophy, can help integrate faith and life, while false philosophy can cause a compartmentalization or even a rejection of faith. And because Catholic culture forms when faith and life are integrated, that's when you get culture, Catholic culture. So philosophy plays a role in the formation of Catholic culture. Here I'm following Pope St. John Paul II, who in Fides et Ratio wrote the following, and I quote, "Philosophy has the great responsibility of forming thought and culture," end quote. Here's another quote from him in that same document. "Faith purifies reason, and philosophy is an engagement of reason." And to be clear here, the kind of culture I'm talking about is not high culture. It's not a kind of culture that's accessible only to the wealthy or the really well-educated. Hear what I'm talking about when I say culture, when Pope John Paul II talks about culture. He's talking about that shared way of life that nurtures the Catholic virtues, faith, hope, charity, the cardinal virtues as well. The kind of shared life that nurtures development, growth in the faith, and leads to saint-making, heroic virtue. That's what I mean by culture. And this is not something that we can have just as individuals. Just like you can't have a language on your own, a private individual language. Culture isn't something you can just have on your own either. Culture is always something shared. Share activities together, share beliefs together, share meals together, share liturgy together, share philosophy together. Shared activities, that's what I'm talking about with culture. So when I talk about Catholic conversion and formation of Catholic culture, what I'm really talking about is our own culture, not so much the world around us. The faith moves outward, and you can't give what you don't have. Insofar as our own culture or life is not formed in a Catholic way, we can't give what we don't have. But the more we develop Catholic culture, the more it's attractive, the more it's effusive, the more it spreads, the more we can have something to invite others into, a life, a dynamic life, something like you could see in the beginning of the book of Acts. Now, the title of my talk is taken from Matthew's Gospel, the 5th chapter, the city on the hill, and I'm sure you're familiar with this passage. The church is the city on the hill, which shed light to the whole world. The second part of the title, though, has to do with the cave, Plato's cave from his Republic. That might be less familiar. Maybe I should review that, right? If you've taken some philosophy, this could have been a few years ago. The cave is from an allegory that Plato's giving to describe and explain what education is. Now, Plato's a pagan, not a Catholic. But he's trying to illustrate what education is, and he's denying that education is the infusion of knowledge. What he's arguing is that education is turning the person to see the truth. So in the cave, there are prisoners chained to the back wall of the cave, and they've been there their whole lives, and they can't even turn their heads, and they're just seeing shadows in the back of the wall of the cave, and they assume that these shadows are the real world. And then someone comes into the cave, breaks the chains and bonds that bind them to the cave, and drags them, notice drags, because they don't want to leave, drags them out of the cave, out into the sunlight, and it blinds them, as it were. They can't see, their eyes are not adjusted. And then they begin to see trees and flowers for shadows and things that are dark. And finally, they're able to see the sun, S-U-N. Now, the whole thing is an allegory. The whole thing is an allegory. But grace builds on nature. So when Plato talks about education, there's an analogy here to evangelism. Because evangelism is a kind of education. It's not mere education, not just giving truths, propositions. It's much more than that, of course. But there is an educational dimension to evangelism. So you could think of an evangelist as someone who's going into the cave, breaking those bonds with the help of the Holy Spirit, and pulling people out of the darkness into the light of the truth. And the sun, for Plato, represents the form of the good, which we could almost say is God who is goodness itself. How then is philosophy a preparation for the gospel? What prepares those in darkness to see the light? We're familiar with the idea that John the Baptist came before the Lord to prepare the way. And I'm sure we're familiar with the way that God prepared the Hebrew people as a people in whom to bring his son, the Messiah. We might be less familiar with what some of the early church fathers said about the role of philosophy in preparing the way for the gospel. We can see this, for example, in St. Justin Martyr, 2nd century saint, St. Clement of Alexandria, also 2nd century, 3rd century apologist Octavius, and church historian Eusebius of Caesarea in the 4th century. He wrote a work called The Preparation of the Gospel, and he completed it about 314 AD. St. Clement of Alexandria wrote the following, and I'll quote about the role of philosophy. Philosophy, he said, is a kind of preparatory training to those who attain to faith. For God is the cause of all good things, but of some primarily, as of the Old and New Testaments, and of others by consequence, as philosophy. Perchance, too, philosophy was given to the Greeks directly and primarily, for philosophy, he said, was a schoolmaster to bring the Hellenic mind to Christ. Philosophy, therefore, was a preparation, paving the way for him who is perfected in Christ. End quote. 2nd century AD. 3rd century Origen said the same thing. He called philosophy the prelude and help of Christianity. Augustine said something similar. I won't go through the church fathers, but you get the idea. If this philosophical tradition helped prepare the way for Christ and his gospel, then in a time such as our own, follow me now, if philosophy has been abandoned or lost, let's say, we're kind of back in a condition where we need philosophy again to prepare the way for the gospel, especially if scientism is prevalent, because scientism, as I'll explain in a minute, is a kind of rejection of philosophy, right? If science is the only way to know, that means there's no way of knowing through philosophy. So insofar as we've rejected philosophy, we're sort of right back where we were right before the time of Socrates, needing philosophy in a way to prepare the way for the gospel. Pope St. John Paul II affirmed this role for philosophy as well in his 1998 encyclical, Fides et Ratio, writing, quote, "The Church considers philosophy an indispensable help for a deeper understanding of faith and for communicating the truth of the gospel to those who do not yet know it." Okay? End quote. St. Augustine wrote that philosophy is that by which the most wholesome faith is begotten, is nourished, defended, and made strong, end quote. Earlier this year, Bishop Barron said the following, and I'm going to quote his exact words. "My mentor, Cardinal George of Chicago, used to say the problem with the religion-science debate is that we've allowed philosophy to fade away." That's the end of the quote from Cardinal George. But Bishop Barron kept going. "You see what he meant. Philosophy as a non-scientific way of knowing," end quote. So the late Cardinal George was saying the same thing. We've lost philosophy, and that's the problem in the science-faith debate. Okay, so I'm going to get into Catholic philosophical tradition, and I'm going to explain 3 philosophical errors. Before I do that, let me say a couple things about philosophy that you might not know or might be helpful to know. First, what is philosophy? Philosophy is the pursuit of wisdom, both theoretical wisdom, practical wisdom. It's not just ivory tower pontification. It's the pursuit of wisdom. The early church fathers saw Christianity as the fulfillment of philosophy. They saw Christ as the genuine Socrates. Socrates is just a model. Christ is the real thing. Secondly, philosophy is unique in a certain way. We can avoid certain topics like astronomy or geology or endocrinology, but you can't avoid philosophy. Pope St. John Paul II wrote, "The human being is by nature a philosopher." And then Aristotle, here's the money quote. You say one must philosophize, then you must philosophize. You say one should not philosophize, then to prove your contention, you must philosophize. In any case, you must philosophize. End quote. Now, what's his point? You can't avoid it. So the only question is, will you do it well or will you do it poorly? Will you do it as informed or will you do it in ignorance or naivety? A third aspect of philosophy is one I mentioned a bit earlier, that philosophy integrates. It doesn't like compartmentalization, because you're looking for a whole picture, a whole complete unified picture of reality. And so you want to see how science fits together with the human dimension. The same exact question I was wrestling with in medical school. How do I fit this idea of helping human persons with all the scientific explanations of the human body? How do I fit that with faith? How do I fit that with history? How do I fit that with geology? Right? How do these all fit together? What's the overall purpose of life? Philosophical question. Fourth feature of philosophy is that philosophy or philosophical training allows you to identify implicit philosophy. In other words, it allows you to have your eyes open to the presence and role, causal role, of philosophy at work in the culture around you. So the more training you have in philosophy or awareness of philosophy, the more you see philosophical assumptions everywhere. One time I wrote a line on the board for my students and I said, "What do you see?" And they said, "We just see the sentence." And it was at that moment that I realized, it was clear to me that the philosophical training that I had changed the way I see. Because when I saw the sentence on the board, I saw all the premises that would need to be assumed in order to get to that statement, and I saw all the implications that would follow if it were true. So it's just like if a chess player is playing, they see differently than a novice who's never played chess before. They see the board differently. The more training you'll have in philosophy or awareness of philosophy, the more you see it at work. Oh, that's what's going on in that film or that narrative or that show. That's the philosophical assumption at work in that person's choices and activities and claims. You recognize it. And philosophy is most dangerous when you don't see it, because it's still at work. Okay, so let me say something about the Catholic philosophical tradition. Did you know that we have a philosophical tradition as Catholics? One of those hidden secrets of the church. You become Catholic and you just keep discovering new treasures, right? Sometime you might hear, like I have heard, that the Catholic intellectual tradition amounts only to the search for truth. But the Catholic intellectual tradition includes not only the divine revelation of Scripture and apostolic tradition, it also includes philosophical development, philosophical wisdom that's been handed down by Catholics in the church for 2,000 years. There's content to the Catholic philosophical tradition. The Catholic philosophical tradition is part of the broader Catholic intellectual tradition. Now, some people have said that there is no Catholic philosophical tradition because they've drawn this from a particular line in Fides et Ratio that reads, "The Church has no philosophy of her own, nor does she canonize any one particular philosophy in preference to others," end quote. Okay, that's true. But what that means is that when Christ came, he did not reveal a philosophy. Okay? So there's no official philosophy. It doesn't mean that there's not such a thing as Christian philosophy, which Pope St. John Paul II talks about in Fides et Ratio. This is philosophy done in dynamic union with the faith. It's not built on divine revelation, right? So the premises in Catholic philosophy are not taken from Scripture or the apostles. But it's done in light of reason, but it's informed by Catholic faith. So you can be drawing from the Catholic faith to guide you as you do your philosophizing. That's the Catholic philosophical tradition. You might be wondering, well, if there is a Catholic philosophical tradition, how did we get into this present mess? Why is there so much confusion? And that's an important question, but difficult to answer in a short space. And I will say here that I think that one of the most helpful people who have addressed this question in the last 50 years is a Catholic philosopher, a convert as well, Alistair MacIntyre. I would point you to his book, After Virtue, for one place to start. But he's also written some subsequent works that talk about this, Whose Justice, Which Rationality, and 3 Rival Versions of Moral Inquiry. And in these works, he helps us see why we've arrived where we are in this mess and confusion, philosophically. The first point he gives us, and I'm summarizing and simplifying here, is that philosophical reasoning always takes place in a tradition. You never just philosophize in a vacuum. You always use what you have brought with you, whether you're aware of that or not. Secondly, he says there are 3 primary philosophical traditions in the present day. Okay, 3. The first one is the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, broadly speaking, going all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, going through St. Thomas. That's the Church's Catholic philosophical tradition, broadly understood. Now, in the time of the Enlightenment, there's a new philosophy that arises, which he calls the Enlightenment philosophy, or another term for it. But this is a kind of philosophy that rejects the role of tradition. It's philosophy done as if tradition is only a hindrance. So you want to try to get away from all tradition, including religious tradition. So religious tradition is seen as an obstacle or hindrance to philosophy. And that's led to a lot of confusion. And the third present philosophical tradition is the Nietzschean tradition. And the Nietzschean tradition is aimed at unmasking the Enlightenment tradition. It's all about removing the mask and exposing it for what it is. An attempt to be objective and neutral and just find the truth from a God's eye point of view, as it were. But really, it's just an activity of exercising power over others. And if you know something about the present day and what's going on in college campuses, you're going to see a lot of appeals to this idea of power. that all relationships in which there's some kind of tension are treated as if what's going on is actually power being exploited over other people. People are being exploited in the name of some kind of power. And that's arising from the Nietzschean tradition. Why is that important to know? Because if we don't know that, we just think, well, what is philosophy? Where do I go? You've got to know there are at least three traditions. Aristotelian Thomistic, that's the Catholic one, the Enlightenment philosophy, and the Nietzschean tradition. And why do I say that? Because, for example, you're familiar with St. Thomas's 5 ways. I assume most of you are familiar with it, right? 5 ways to argue for the existence of God. How do you think those 5 ways are treated in an ordinary introduction to philosophy class at any university across the country? If Aquinas even gets a mention, and unfortunately now he does get more than he did in the past, but if Aquinas gets a mention, those 5 ways are addressed and dismissed in about 10 to 15 minutes at the most. And then we move on. Not realizing that these 5 ways are written within a tradition. And in order to understand them and evaluate them rightly, you have to know the tradition. You have to be immersed in the tradition. In fact, you need to be formed in the tradition. So Aquinas' 5 ways are often approached from the point of view from the Enlightenment tradition, and therefore not accurately or fairly evaluated. Just as appreciation of beautiful music requires formation, appreciation of beautiful chess requires training, study of the game, appreciation of beautiful poetry requires formation, so recognition and appreciation of wisdom requires formation. And that's why philosophy and philosophical understanding requires formation. It's not something we can just do from scratch on our own. This applies not only at the level of wisdom, but at the level of logic. About a month ago, I'll mention Bishop Barron again, he put out a video, you might have seen it. It was titled something like The Vanishing of Argument. The replacement of argument with bullying, shouting, or violence. And I would add the replacement of argument with meme, GIF, or emoticon. Insofar as this trend is a result of a loss of a shared capacity to engage in argument. And here the word argument already has a negative connotation, doesn't it? I imagine it does, just kind of looking at your faces. But argument is a good thing. There are 2 different senses of the term, right? There's the quarrel, the fighting, the raised blood pressure. That's the bad. But argument in the sense of reasoning, if we lose that, how can we reason with others about the gospel? Grace builds on nature. Right? So reasoning with persons about the gospel requires their capacity to reason. And therefore, they need to have some logic. And if we lose logic as a culture, as a society, it makes it much more difficult to reason and to share the gospel. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about 3 errors in philosophy. 3 prominent errors, actually 3 categories of errors. And before I do so, I want to make sure it's clear that by criticizing a philosophical error, I'm not criticizing the persons who hold that error. It's an important distinction. People who hold false philosophies are not our enemies. They're not my enemies. Right? We love them. We have compassion on them in a non-patronizing way. We assume that they're doing the best they can. Secondly, in every philosophical system, even those that are false, there's always some truth. So it's not helpful to just kind of broad brush and say, well, that's just a false philosophy, reject it completely. No, we need to recognize that there is truth in false philosophy, some truth, because that's a meeting point. If you encounter someone who holds a false philosophy, try to find the common ground, the meeting point, the truth you can affirm together and agree on, because that's the point of departure from which your reasoning will take place. So the first of the 3 categories of philosophical errors is skepticism. And by skepticism, I don't mean kind of just cautiousness with regard to believing the latest news report or something. That's prudent. That's not skepticism here. I don't mean disbelief in God, although that would be a kind of skepticism. Here I'm talking about philosophical skepticism, the notion that philosophy can't produce knowledge, that we can't know anything philosophically, that the only way of knowing is something non-philosophical, namely through the scientific method. So scientism is one form of skepticism. Why is this an error? Because we can acquire knowledge through philosophy. It's difficult, requires training, discipline, humility, and so on, but we can. When I was in medical school, the reason why I held on to the human dimension was not just because of faith, though that's true, but I knew it from human experience. Grew up in a small rural community in Western Michigan. You grow up in a community, you know people as people. That's something you have. It's not something you got in a class. You can't deny that without denying yourself. So we learn things, we acquire knowledge, not just through the scientific method. And that's crucial. And I'm not even talking about theology yet. We haven't even cracked Scripture. Just things that we know as humans without the scientific method. Another form of philosophical skepticism can be seen in this idea of chronological snobbery, what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery, assuming that the past is something to be rejected entirely. I know of a student, not my student, and not even on my school or campus, who won't even hear the word tradition, is angered and made emotionally distressed by the word tradition, because that's the past, and the past is oppressive. Another form of philosophical skepticism is what Pope Francis calls the technocratic paradigm, this idea that it's through technology and the growth of the economy that our problems will be solved. Well, that's also a kind of philosophical skepticism, because it leaves out ethics. It leaves out theology, too. Another form of philosophical skepticism, a very common one, is what's called emotivism. Emotivism is the notion that ethical claims, like murder is wrong, are merely expressions of emotions. It's also called the boo-rah theory, right? If you don't like murder, you just say boo, 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 boo. Right? We don't like it. And that's what we mean when we say it's wrong. Or if we see someone running an animal shelter, yay, 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 we like it. Right? It's good. So what we mean by good and evil is just we like it or we don't like it. It makes us feel good or it makes us feel bad. It's all at the level of emotions. That's emotivism. And what that does, that departs from the Aristotelian Thomistic Catholic philosophical tradition, which grounds ethics at the level of the intellect, not at the level of the emotions, fundamentally. Are emotions important for ethics? Of course. Sometimes emotions move our intellect if we're rightly formed, rightly ordered. The virtuous person is moved in his emotions. But they're not grounded in the emotions. But in the context of philosophical skepticism, you lose the possibility of knowing ethics here. Ethics becomes a matter of emotion. You ever heard someone say, with regard to an ethical claim, well, I feel that ... You ever heard someone labeled a blank phobe or a hater for holding some position? You ever notice the emojis that are available to you on Facebook? It's not like there's an argument emoji option. Premise one, premise two. No, there's just, well, how do you feel about it? Are you angry? Are you sad? Right? Oh, symptoms of emotion. It's easy. You can just condense it to an emoticon. An argument, by contrast, that's complicated. You got to lay out your premises. Emotivism is at least part of the reason for the widespread confusion in our society regarding what love is. A lot of young people think that love is an emotion. It's a feeling. Whereas in the Catholic philosophical tradition, love is a virtue at the level of the will. A choice, the will, not at the emotion level. Yes, we have affection toward people we love, but that's not fundamentally what love is. So how do you expect marriages to last if love is fundamentally emotion? Emotions are like this. Emotivism removes faith from the level of intellect and will and centers it in the emotions. Sometimes young people who are immersed and saturated in this culture of emotivism think that faith is an emotion. But faith, if you know your theology right, is not an emotion. The supernatural virtue of faith is a virtue in the intellect. And charity, the highest of the theological virtues, is a virtue in the will. When philosophy drops out of the picture and there's no longer capacity to reason together, to resolve our disagreements, the default result is a contest of power. If we cannot reason together to resolve our differences, then we resort to coercion, manipulation. And that's dangerous. It's expressed as violence even. In this way, the contemporary social phenomenon of retreating into protective bubbles, and I'm sure you know what I'm talking about online or in social media, Facebook, people retreat into protective bubbles. Bubbles of like-minded persons who serve as an echo chamber, and this is exacerbated by philosophical skepticism, but because you can't talk to the people outside your bubble. It will be fruitless and possibly even dangerous. A general loss in a society of a capacity to engage in shared rational deliberation inclines us to resort to techniques of power and to pull ourselves in to bubbles of people who are like-minded. And what does that do to the potential for evangelism? It makes it much more difficult. No Catholic should reach the age of 18 and not know what philosophical skepticism is and what is wrong with it. A second category of philosophical errors are errors about God and religion. Two primary ones to start with are rationalism and fideism. Rationalism is the notion that we can figure it all out through reason. We don't need to rely on divine revelation. This error presupposes either that God doesn't exist or that humans are God, which is pretty much the same thing, right? If there is a God who is higher than me in a qualitative way, then I should expect that there are things that I cannot figure out on my own, permanently, ever, unless they're revealed to me, and that I would have to receive by trust, not because I've figured them out and saw for myself. So rationalism presupposes that there's no being like that higher than me, and in that way, it's irrational. That's kind of the irony. Rationalism is irrational. That's not the most common error, though, that I see. Fideism is the flip side of that. Fideism is the notion that faith is a blind leap. And I've seen this more in my Catholic students over time. A notion that it's not because of a connection to reason or there's evidence for believing in God or believing in Jesus or believing in the Catholic Church. It's because it makes me feel good, or it's some kind of blind leap. That's fideism. Fideism disconnects faith and reason. It makes faith, the act of faith, arbitrary and irrational. Why? Because if I were to leap in a blindfolded way, that'd be pretty dangerous. If I was in a dangerous area and I just blindfolded myself, spun around and leaped, I could kill myself. Blind leaps are dangerous and foolish. That's not the Catholic Church's position, but a lot of young people don't know that. In contrast to these two errors of rationalism and fideism, Catholic philosophical tradition lays out a middle position, a middle path. First, as the First Vatican Council taught, there are many things we can know about God just through reason. We can even know, says the First Vatican Council, that God exists, and we can know that with certainty. We heard the Romans passage read earlier about having no excuse. So through philosophy, God's existence and divine attributes can be known with certainty. Secondly, there are motives of credibility. And motives of credibility is something that every Catholic should know. Motives of credibility are that by which we assent to the faith. They don't make faith something that's the result of a syllogism. You don't say premise 1, premise 2, therefore I guess Jesus is the Son of God. It's not like that. But the act of faith is not blind. It's guided by reason because of motives of credibility. When God gives revelation through a human messenger, he doesn't just expect us to believe. That would be unreasonable. So as the First Vatican Council says, God gives external indications of his revelation, divine acts, and first and foremost, miracles and prophecies. Things that no mere human could do, but that only God can do, and that therefore demonstrate that the person who is in fact carrying a divine message. Think of the way Moses demonstrated to Pharaoh that God had in fact sent him. Look at all these plagues. I can't do that as a mere mortal, right? When you see all these plagues, you know that this is the finger of God. Right? So is it reasonable for Pharaoh to believe Moses? Yes. It's not irrational for him to believe Moses, that Moses is sent by God, because their motives of credibility have been supplied. Same with Christ. Have motives of credibility been supplied? Yes. Look at the miracles that Christ did. Look at his resurrection from the dead. Another philosophical error having to do with religion and faith is the following. It's the notion that the reason why there is such a thing as faith and religion is because it has some social benefit. And you might have heard this or seen this before, right? This idea, you can find it in a kind of evolutionary psychology class, or even in certain sociologies, that religion formed and came into existence over time because it pulled the community together, had this cohesive effect, this pragmatic benefit, and that's why there's religion. Not because it's true, it's just because it makes us work together as a society. How do we respond to that? I have discovered that many students don't know how to respond to that, and they're very vulnerable to that objection, because what it does, it explains religion away entirely, right? You've just fallen into this little thing that was sort of an evolutionary byproduct that helped people come together and be more cohesive. Get rid of that. Well, I love taking on this objection here. This position falls into what's called the Bulverism fallacy, which is a funny word. And this fallacy assumes, but does not prove, that the position that you've taken is false. It assumes, but does not prove, that the position that you've taken is false. And then tries to explain how you came to believe this false position in the first place. So, for example, if I said, in our time especially, Catholic youth need formation in the Catholic philosophical tradition, and someone were to reply, oh, the reason you're making this claim is because you're a philosopher and so you just want to keep a job. That would be an example of Bulverism. It's assuming that what I'm saying is false and then trying to explain why I came to that false position. That's exactly what this evolutionary psychology explanation does. It assumes that we believe something false and then tries to explain how we came to it through some social benefit. Well, sure, there are social benefits, but that's not why we believe the Catholic faith. Again, point back to, why do I believe the Catholic faith? So respect my answer to that question, right? Look at the motives of credibility. Look at Christ himself, right? That's why I believe. So we have to know the Bulverism fallacy in order to properly respond to that objection, which is a powerful objection if you don't know the Bulverism fallacy. Another common error with regard to religion and faith is nihilism. Nihilism is the notion that there is no meaning or purpose in life. You know what the number 2 cause of death among young people is today in the US? Suicide. That's right. Nihilism and suicide go together. And I'm not saying that those who commit suicide are all nihilist, but there's a relationship between them. Under nihilism, the only purpose in life is, in effect, to check off every item on your bucket list and then kick the bucket. But science doesn't show us overall meaning. That is, meaning and purpose falls outside the range of what science can detect. So if you're committed to scientism and the notion that that's the only way to know through the scientific method, what happens? Meaning, purpose, value, these drop out of the picture. And the default response will be some kind of hedonism. I just have fun and then I die. And when life gets no fun anymore, exit early. Nihilism has no answer to suffering. Pain is to be avoided at all costs for nihilism. Whereas for a Catholic, we have something in suffering. This is redemptive, either for myself or for others. Suffering is turned into love for us. This right there is a powerful response to nihilism. We demonstrate love for others through offering up, I know the phrase, offering up our suffering. That is a powerful demonstration to the nihilist that there can be meaning in suffering, that it's not gratuitous. Seeing the meaning in reality, seeing the purpose in reality, seeing that the world is not nihilistic, that requires philosophical eyes. You can get those through theology too, by a gift of the Holy Spirit, but you can get them through philosophy as well, at the natural level. The last set of errors are anthropological, that is, about the human person. First, a loss of dignity. When you lose philosophy, you lose the ability to see that humans have intrinsic dignity. That our value is not just in what we can do and how useful we are to others or to the marketplace or the job, but just in who we are as human beings made in the image of God. Even if you don't bring God into the picture, just human beings as rational beings, that is, a being with a rational nature, already you get intrinsic dignity in philosophy, in the Catholic philosophical tradition. But without philosophy, you just get reductionism. All I am fundamentally is atoms in motion. Where's value? Where's dignity? Gone. In 2008, Steven Pinker wrote a book, an article titled The Stupidity of Dignity, Harvard psychologist. Dignity, there's no way to discover it without philosophy. Just this summer, another person wrote a book titled Humanity Without Dignity, Harvard University Press, denying that there's intrinsic human dignity. That's what's going on. Right? And the Catholic philosophical tradition says otherwise. A second error with regard to the human person is what's called body-soul dualism. This is the idea that I'm just using my body. I am not my body. This is not part of me. It's just something I inhabit, like something like getting in a car and driving a car. So it degrades the body and distances ourselves from the body. There's sort of an irony there, because it reduces the person to a self, and a subjective consciousness. That's all you are. So if you're no longer conscious or possibly conscious, you're gone. The person's gone. So it takes away dignity from the body as well. A third error with regard to the human person is expressive individualism. And this has two components. One is an error at the level of what freedom is. Freedom, on this notion, is the ability to do whatever I want. But in the Catholic tradition, freedom is what's called moral liberty, the ability to do the right thing. The person who is virtuous is free. There's a line my old graduate instructor used to say, what does the virtuous person do? And it's a trick question. The answer, whatever he wants, because he's virtuous. So whatever he does will be good and what he most deeply wants. That's freedom. Secondly, there's a kind of individualism, inexpressive individualism, that denies our social nature. It denies that by nature we flourish only in community with others, in friendship with others, real, authentic friendship, not just internet connection friendships, but real community. That our being, our very structure is oriented to the common good, rather than just how can I make the most out of society. And this leads to hedonism and consumerism, this individualism. This also leads to confusion about marriage and our bodies with regard to our sexuality. Surely you've noticed that. When you combine expressive individualism with this body-soul dualism that I mentioned above, you get this kind of confusion regarding what our sexuality is in relation to our body, particularly in the form of a gender ideology that Pope Francis has repeatedly criticized. The givenness of the body is not recognized as part of one's given identity. Instead, the body is viewed as something that can be treated like an artifact, subject to an unbounded range of modifications and mutilations, to make it conform to one's willed conception of what one wishes to identify as. And this is voluntarism. This is a philosophical error about what we are as persons. And it's the same with marriage. Marriage is seen as a construct, a human construct, something we make, rather than as something that's written in our nature, discovered with regard to how humans come together to procreate. So its relation to procreation shows this kind of natural institution that's discovered, not just created. That's a philosophical discovery because it lies outside the bounds of science or the scientific method. Insofar as the city on the hill is encumbered with the same philosophical errors as those still in the cave, it cannot successfully free those in the cave. It still plays the same games as those in the cave and retains their mind, not only in memory, but in actuality. If the church is to fulfill its role in extricating prisoners from the cave, and here I am including in that extrication the catechesis and formation of our own Catholics, we must retrieve the Catholic philosophical tradition by which we can engage these philosophical errors in the broader society, errors about philosophy itself, such as skepticism, errors about God and religion, such as fideism, or the sociology or psychology of religion that engages in Bulverism, nihilism, errors about the human person, such as blindness to intrinsic dignity, body-soul dualism, and expressive individualism. Part of what prepares the way of the Lord in his ongoing redemptive work in the world, what makes his path straight, fills in valleys, makes mountains and hills low, straightens what is crooked, and levels the rough places, is the rich treasure in the Catholic philosophical tradition. We need to recognize and retrieve the necessary role it plays so that all flesh may see the salvation of God. Amen.